Florida may not be known for great differences in elevation, but even small changes result in distinctly different plant communities. Whether dominated by pine forests, hardwood hammocks, or scrub communities, upland habitats provide unique and important ecological contributions to the Florida environment. So join us as we explore Florida's fascinating upland habitats. Welcome to the Florida Master Naturalist Program, an environmental education curriculum designed to increase awareness and appreciation of Florida's natural resources. Your host is Dr. Marty Main, wildlife ecologist with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Join Marty and his special guests as they take you on a tour of Florida's spectacular natural world.
Florida has many kinds of upland habitats. Some are dominated by characteristic forest communities, such as pinelands and hardwood forests. Others, such as scrub, dry prairie, and rangelands are not. During this video, we'll visit scrub, dry prairies, and rangelands. And let's start by visiting one of Florida's most ancient habitat types, scrub habitat on the Lake Wales Ridge. Sea level has historically influenced Florida's shape and size, and, at times, all but the highest areas of the peninsula were beneath the sea. As sea levels subsided, these ancient dune systems became isolated as a series of ridges in the center of the state, the largest of which is known as the Lake Wales Ridge. Today, we refer to these ancient dune systems as scrub, and these areas provide critical habitat for many unique plants and animals that evolved adaptations to survive in these harsh environments. We travel to the Archbold Biological Station on the Lake Wales Ridge, where we'll explore several types of scrub habitat with scrub ecologist Mark Dayrup. Mark, you mentioned that this is called an oak scrub, but I don't see any giant oaks in this habitat. Can you tell me a little bit about why this is called an oak scrub?
Well, most of the plants you see out here are oaks, and they may be small, but they're old. So this one here, for example, is a mature oak, and you can tell that because it's got these catkins on it. These are the male flowers, and the female flowers are even smaller than that. It's a wind-pollinated plant, so as the wind blows over the scrub, it pollinates all these oaks. And this is a species which has been burned off and resprouted and burned off and resprouted many times. And they grow underground. So if you think of a tree that lives in a forest up north, it dominates territory by moving out like that and shading its neighbors. But you can't do that if fires come along. So these do the opposite. They dominate territory by moving underground. So they have roots that spread out all around them. And every time there's a burn, all those roots sprout, so you get hundreds and hundreds of shoots. And that's what you're seeing out here. Thousands of oak shoots that are fighting for space after the fire that came through here in 2001.
Now, although this is an oak scrub, certainly there are many more plants than just oaks in this habitat.
So a lot of the plants you see around here are either palmettos or they're species that are in the blueberry family. So this is one here. This is in the blueberry family. This is called well, there's a couple of species. There's stagger bushes and fetter bushes. They have these pretty little pink flowers.
Right, these are the Lyonia genus.
Right. And the group of the blueberries is very resistant to poor soil conditions. So they grow in bogs, but they also grow on these extraordinarily sterile sands. And if you were to try and grow normal plants on these sands, you wouldn't get anywhere because there are virtually no nutrients available. And they all have to grow using special tricks associated with fungi, probably bacteria, things like that.
So the adaptations of these plants have to be to nutrient-poor and acidic conditions.
Plus fire.
Plus fire. Mark, there are many plants that are found only in Florida scrub, the scrub palmetto being one. You want to tell me a little bit about this plant?
Yeah, this is a common scrub plant, and you can tell it from regular palmettos or saw palmettos because the stem of the leaf goes right up the leaf like that. Plus, it's got these nice little fibers on it, all curled up. And these are what scrub jays use to make their nests out of. In fact, at the right season, in nest building season, if you hold these up, scrub jays may come take them right out of your fingers. And you have to look at everything in terms of fire adaptations here. And this one has a fire adaptation, which is that the growing point, the vulnerable growing point of the plant, is underground, buried quite deep in the sand. So when a fire comes through, it doesn't kill the plant. And over here, I think, we have a saw palmetto.
All right.
And a saw palmetto is widespread in lots of habitats, but it's also fire adapted. And what it does is something completely different. It grows along the ground with a stem, and that's what this black thing is. And it sends up shoots along the stem. So if it gets burned off at the end, it can send up lots of shoots. And the way you tell this from a scrub palmetto, aside from the fact that it grows along the ground, is that all the little fingers of this leaf come out from exactly the same point. And it doesn't have the little fibers. And if you really want to test, you can run your finger rapidly up there and get a cut on your thumb. So, because it's called a saw palmetto because it's got these little saws on it.
Mark, now we've looked at several species in this community, and it strikes me that most of them resprout.
Yeah, this is what you might call a sprouter community because it's formed of plants that sprout right after a fire. And they'd be constantly rejuvenated or made young again by the fire. So that these plants here could be virtually immortal. These little oaks that are just up to your waist, they could be hundreds or even thousands of years old. They could be as old as the redwoods.
So it's not just the landform that's old, it's the plants as well.
That's right. It's an ancient habitat full of ancient species.
Now, there's must be plants that have another strategy, a reseeding strategy.
Yeah, we can go to a place where you can see that, where there are scrub plants that come up from seeds after fire.
As with other Florida habitats, slight differences in elevation and hydrology can have dramatic influences on plant communities in scrub environments. Mark and I traveled only a short distance to find ourselves at a slightly higher elevation and in a distinctly different scrub habitat.
Well, Marty, we're about 50 feet higher here, so the habitat has changed quite a lot.
Yeah, I see different species. Well, here's the Florida rosemary.
Yeah, the Florida rosemary is one of the dominant plants of this habitat. And in fact, the whole habitat is called a rosemary bald because there are rosemaries and then there's bare sand in between.
I see. Plants that live in this community must have some special adaptations.
Well, this is one of the seeding plants that we mentioned before. These plants, although they look old, are actually probably only 60 or 70 years old. And when a fire comes through, they'll come up from little seeds that are stored in the sand down there.
I see, instead of resprouting. Now, I also understand that there are some special things about the Florida rosemary. Would you like to share some of those?
Yeah, this is an interesting plant in lots of ways. What looks like needles are actually very finely rolled up leaves, so that the breathing pores of the leaves, which lose water, are actually in a groove so that they don't lose water so much. This plant also has its own chemicals so that specialized insects feed on it. Like there's a particular grasshopper that feeds only on rosemary. There's a beautiful green inchworm moth, which is a rosemary specialist. And there's a beetle as well. So it has its own insects and its own habitat.
I've heard that some scientists have suggested this plant even tries to protect its growing space with chemicals.
Well, there is a theory that they're either from the roots or from dead leaves. They're chemicals that are leached out that then kill the roots of other plants.
Now, in addition to the rosemary, there are some other plants that have managed to survive in this difficult situation, such as lichens.
Well, lichens can live without any soil nutrients whatsoever, so that's good. And they can protect themselves against drying. The fungal skeleton of the lichen holds the algae safe from drying winds, which is what we have to contend with here. And in addition to that, they have chemical repellents that keep insects from attacking them, or most insects from attacking them. So that protects them when they're out in the open like this.
Mark, so we've looked at some of these plants that are adapted to this harsh environment, but there's also wildlife that are adapted to this environment as well.
Well, you won't see many wildlife out here because most of them are not stupid enough to sit out in the sun in the middle of the scrub during the day. But there are deer that utilize this area during the night. There are also various kinds of raccoons and foxes that are here. Scrub jays come through here quite regularly. And then, of course, there are many things that are much harder to see. Swimming through the sand, there are lizards, and there are blind, flightless beetles, and there are tiny crickets that live nowhere else. There's a whole world of insects and spiders and things right under our feet.
Now, one of the things I think is somewhat fascinating is that many of the species of insects occur on the scrub and, for the most part, nowhere else.
Well, I think that's mostly because the habitat is so different, especially the sand. These deep, dry sands are very special for burrowing animals. And then, of course, when you have unusual kinds of plants, then those unusual plants have their own species of insects as well.
In addition to effects caused by changes in elevation and hydrology, slight differences in soil nutrients also influence plant communities in scrub environments. We visit one last scrub habitat on the Lake Wales Ridge, where tiny amounts of minerals and nutrients create improved growing conditions that enable scrub-adapted trees, such as sand pines, to survive. So Mark, this is sand pine scrub.
Yeah, you can see the sand pines all around us, and you can tell it's quite different in the growth form, largely because the soil conditions are a little different, and there's a longer burn return interval.
I see. Now, you said the soil conditions are different. I understand this is considered to be yellow sand as opposed to white sand, where we just left.
Right. The sand here has a tiny amount of clay and iron in it, and that makes it better for plant growth.
I see. Well, certainly there's a lot of plants. I mean, in addition to the sand pine, I see a number of other species as well.
Yeah, there's scrub hickories here, and there's turkey oak right there. So it's a good place for a lot of different kinds of plants.
Now, in terms of the fire interval, that leads us into management of scrub. And in general, I understand the scrub has quite a wide fire interval.
Yeah, it's almost anything from around 15 to 50 years, which is allows us a lot of flexibility in management of scrub. That's actually one of the good things about scrub is it's not that difficult to manage, just given a little common sense.
Now, of course, I guess the last thing I'd like to discuss briefly are the conservation successes with scrub. I understand we've had some in the last couple decades.
Yeah, in this area, particularly on the Lake Wales Ridge, the southern Lake Wales Ridge, there have been many purchases of scrub habitat, so that species which we thought we might well lose now seem to be pretty well protected.
In addition to interior scrub that occurs on ancient dune systems along Florida's central ridge, scrub also occurs in coastal areas. Although there are many similarities between coastal and interior scrub, coastal scrub is not nearly as old, and the effects of salt spray create different environmental conditions than those experienced on Florida's central ridge. For these reasons, coastal scrub habitat is not identical to scrub on the Lake Wales Ridge, but provides critical habitat for a number of different plants and animals. Dry prairie is another rare habitat in Florida. Like scrub, most of Florida's dry prairie has been converted to other land uses. Also like scrub, dry prairie is a fire-adapted community that provides critical habitat for certain species of wildlife. Our next stop is in south central Florida near the Kissimmee River, where we'll explore the largest remaining tract of dry prairie in Florida. Dry prairies, like wet prairies and marshes, are essentially treeless habitats dominated by grasses and herbs. This is Kissimmee Prairie, the largest dry prairie in Florida, and the nesting area of one of Florida's most endangered birds. Hey, Paul.
Good morning.
Having any luck?
Sure am. There's 2 Florida grasshopper sparrows out there singing right now.
Let's have a look. This is Paul Miller. He's the park biologist for the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. Paul, can you tell me a little bit about the Florida grasshopper sparrow?
Be happy to. Florida grasshopper sparrow is a subspecies of the grasshopper sparrow, which is a species that ranges throughout North America. It's got 12 subspecies. Our Florida grasshopper sparrow subspecies occurs only here in the Florida dry prairie.
I see. Now, when we look at the Florida dry prairie, when we look at this habitat, and we see the first thing that strikes you is it's largely a treeless area. Can you tell me a little bit about why that is, and maybe even about some of the dominant plants that live here?
Florida dry prairie actually is one of the most floristic, diverse communities in North America. And superficially, as we look around us, we can see some of the dominant plants. Those would be saw palmetto. The thin grasses are wire grasses. And then we have these short oak trees, which are runner oaks.
Oh, so we actually have some oaks in this system. They're just very small.
They're really small, and that's an adaptation to fire.
I see.
Which ties in with why we don't have large trees in the prairie, and that would be the fire return interval. Florida dry prairie burns roughly every 2 to 3 years, maybe even sooner than that. What that does is, as the pine trees start to grow, the fire comes in and kills them, and they're unable to survive out here.
Right, young pine trees can't do very well with fire usually.
Correct.
Now, I've noticed that in some areas there's a lot more, for instance, saw palmetto than in other areas that may have some more grass. Can you tell me a little bit about that, or show me?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good observation, and there's a good example of that right over here. So Marty, right here we find ourselves in a typical elevation. We see a mixture of palmetto and wiregrasses, some oaks. As we step out into this area, there's a slight depression effect, and you can see that there's a lack of saw palmetto. Grasses become more dominant. And as we move on further this way, we come out of the depression, the land starts to rise maybe a couple inches, and we see more dominant oaks, and then the saw palmetto becomes dominant once more.
So even slight changes in elevation probably influence, well, they must influence the hydrology, and that influences the plant community. Now, these are called dry prairies, but in fact, at certain times of the year, they're quite wet. Isn't that right?
Correct. During our rainy season, the water table comes out of the ground a foot or more, and it will stay saturated for 2 or 3 months.
Periodic flooding is a critical natural process for the diverse plant community that occurs in dry prairie habitat. Although dry prairie is flooded for 2 to 3 months during the rainy season, this habitat is not wet for as long as wet prairies or marshes, which distinguishes this habitat from these wetland communities. However, as with wet prairies and marshes, fire is a critical natural process in dry prairie habitat. Fire enables herbaceous plants to flourish while preventing pines and other woody species from eventually dominating the landscape. Paul and I traveled by swamp buggy to investigate an area that illustrates how burning at different times of the year influences plant communities and creates a mosaic of habitat conditions intended to benefit the greatest number of species.
So Marty, the area we are walking in right now is a non-growing season or cool season burn. And then behind us, you can see an area that we burned during the growing season.
So this area was burned in the fall or winter, and that area was burned in late spring or summer.
Correct.
That's right. Now, there's some effects of a growing season versus a non-growing season burn, especially on some of the native grasses. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
A growing season burn has the effect of allowing the native grasses to put up a winter seed crop, sort of like a wheat field effect. Visually, that's what we're seeing behind us. When you burn grasses or prairie during the non-growing season, you don't get that floristic response.
So you don't actually get seed production as much in a cool season burn.
Correct, and actually that seed production would be important for our winter resident sparrow species, who are seed eaters during the winter.
Right, but sometimes you actually do burn in the winter as well.
We do. We have in the past burned during the non-growing season, obviously, but we are moving towards burning the preserve as much as possible during the growing season. How we understand fire in the prairie is that most of it would have burned during the growing season as a result of the high incidence of lightning strikes.
Now, as long as we're talking about that, let's talk about the last thing, the conservation aspects of dry prairie in Florida in general. Apparently there's not much dry prairie left.
That seems to be the case. As far as we can tell, by looking at historical records and old observations, we've been able to estimate that roughly about 90% of the historical range is gone. 10% or so remains. That 90% has been converted over to primarily cattle ranching for grazing, but also such endeavors as citrus growing, phosphate mines, residential development, etc.
Florida's cattle ranches are collectively referred to as rangelands and represent large areas that include a mosaic of habitats that provide important ecological services while supporting commercial enterprise on private lands. Our last stop will be Buck Island Ranch, which is the home of the MacArthur Agroecology Research Center. We'll be meeting with ecologist Patrick Bolin, who directs research activities on the ranch that address the economic realities and the ecological roles of Florida's ranches. Pat, can you tell me a little bit about the mission of the research center?
Yes, Marty. Well, first I'd like to emphasize we are a working cattle ranch, but we're also a research center. And the mission of the research program is to basically understand the ecology of a working cattle ranch and to use that information to help make cattle ranching more compatible with the environment and also maintain and sustain its economic productivity.
Pat, when people think about cattle ranches, they may just think it's cows and grassy pastures, but it's a complex of habitats, isn't it?
That's right. On a given cattle ranch, there's usually a mosaic of different kinds of habitats that support wildlife populations. We have aquatic habitats, woodlands, and different kinds of pastures, all of which contribute to a diverse and varied landscape.
Yeah, and when you think about cattle ranches throughout the state, that starts to add up for wildlife habitat, I would think.
It sure does. A lot of the open land in Florida, particularly in South Florida, is grazing land. In fact, about 9 million acres in Florida or more are grazed at some point in time, and quite a lot of our land is devoted to the production of cattle or to grazing.
Now, when we think about Florida ranches and grazing land, one of the habitats that's awfully important is this improved pasture. Could you comment a little bit about what an improved pasture is exactly?
That's right. Improved pasture is pasture where the native vegetation has been removed. A lot of the ecosystems in Florida are relatively infertile, and many of these are suitable for the production of introduced forage grasses that come from other countries. So an improved pasture is a pasture where the native vegetation has been removed. These exotic or foreign forage grasses are planted, and they are maintained through the addition of fertilizer, chopping, and mowing, and such as that they are referred to as being kept in an improved state.
Now, these improved pastures, even though they've made an effort to, make it primarily grasses, you still see other plants around, such as these cabbage palms and other things.
Right, and different pastures vary depending on where you are in the state or where you are in a particular cattle ranch, but there are trees, there are wetlands, we have man-made ditches that introduce aquatic habitats into pastures. So even an improved pasture, although it's probably less diverse than a native pasture, still does provide habitat for wildlife and a variety of different kinds of habitats.
Well, the needs of wildlife obviously are food and water and cover and space. And an improved pasture probably doesn't have tremendous amounts of cover, but there's still some species that use it. Can you comment on a couple of the different kinds of animals that you might expect to find using improved pasture?
Sure. We have some species that are maybe a little bit rarer and more threatened than other species that use improved pasture, such as the burrowing owl. We also have very common species that are, although they are common, contribute very much to the wildlife on the ranch and most ranches in Florida, things like the eastern meadowlark, red-winged blackbirds. We have wetlands that have a lot of frogs in them, red-shouldered hawks. So there are quite a variety of different species. Also, the crested caracara is a species, a bird of prey, which actually prefers improved pasture to native pasture, probably because of the extra productivity that we have in these pastures. So there are quite a variety of wildlife that benefit from improved pasture or use it at some point in their life cycle.
Sure, and I would imagine that anywhere improved pasture borders up against either a wetland or a forest, you'd have animals that come out and then forage into the pasture, such as deer.
That's right. And that's where having different landscape elements together is important. There are certain frogs, for example, that in their adult stages live in the trees. Well, they're only going to breed in a pond if the pond is within a certain distance from the trees. So how the different landscape elements are arranged in the landscape also will affect what kinds of animals you're going to encounter.
So certainly you wouldn't want to have all improved pasture throughout Florida. That would be a bad thing. One of the questions that folks might ask, though, is, well, why should you have improved pasture at all? Why not just use all native grasses?
By having improved pastures, the rancher can produce more calves, and by producing more calves, it enables him to ensure that he's going to be economically profitable over the long term. There are some years on the cattle cycle where the rancher loses money, and some years when the rancher makes money. It's about a break even over the long term. So having the improved pasture enables the rancher to ensure good economic profitability and to be able to stay in business.
Now, that also has implications for what you can do with your land in terms of maintaining certain areas in natural habitat.
That's right. By maintaining improved areas such as this, where we have more intensive production and fertilized grasses that we maintain with a higher stocking density during the growing season, we're able to maintain other large areas of the landscape in a much more native state, where we don't have as much alteration of the landscape.
Now, I understand you have your winter range actually is primarily native grasses.
That's right. Most of our winter range here, which comprises about half the ranch, is mainly in native grasses.
Can we go have a look at that?
Sure. Marty, this is an example of one of our more native range areas on the ranch.
I can certainly see a mix of native grasses in here.
Yeah, you can certainly see that this is a lot different from our improved pasture. We have a lot of native grasses in here, native tall grass, the andropogons, a mixture of panicums and other species. It's a much more diverse and, as you can see, an equally productive part of the landscape.
Yeah, and you can just see that this provides a lot more wildlife habitat.
Right. And believe it or not, this has been grazed this winter, so we've had cows in here, but you maintain quite a lot of cover in these tall prairies.
Now, an interspersion of habitats like that also tends to have some benefits for water quality, I would imagine, doesn't it?
Well, yes, it does. The natural wetlands that we have embedded within our prairies and pastures act sort of as natural filtration systems, and they gather the nutrients from the water and take up those nutrients, and the ditches serve the same function. So the wetland habitats are also very important from a water quality standpoint.
Well, that has good repercussions for the future of cattle ranching in Florida, I would imagine.
That's right. Of all the different land uses, cattle ranching is one of the least intensive. So it uses the least amount of fertilizer and other kinds of farm chemicals in relation to other kinds of agriculture. So it's the least intensive, and if done well, has the potential to have the least impact on things like surface water quality, and it's very compatible with the environment, really, cattle ranching.
And really has good implications then for keeping open space and diverse habitats for wildlife.
That's right. Cattle ranches support a lot of open space, they support wildlife, and they help to improve our water quality and supply, and if maintained on the landscape, can serve a very important ecological function for the state of Florida.
I hope this video has given you a greater appreciation for the unique and important ecological roles played by Florida's scrub, prairie, and rangeland habitats. We visited 3 types of interior scrub habitat, all of which are rare environments that support endemic species of plants and endangered wildlife, such as the scrub palmetto and endangered Florida scrub jay. Oak scrub is dominated by shrubby oaks, palmettos, and other shrubs that resprout after fire. At slightly higher and drier elevations, the scrub is dominated by Florida rosemary and referred to as a rosemary bald. Sand pine scrub occurs in areas where slight increases in the nutrient and mineral content of scrub sands greatly improves growing conditions. We also visited coastal scrub habitat, which has many, but not all, of the same plants and animals, because coastal scrub habitats are not nearly as ancient and also have growing conditions that are strongly influenced by the sea. Dry prairie is another rare habitat and, like scrub, supports rare and endangered wildlife, such as the burrowing owl and the Florida grasshopper sparrow. Our last stop was a Florida cattle ranch, where we discussed the important ecological role of Florida's rangelands, which represent a complex of upland and wetland habitats and encompass about 9 million acres, most of which occurs in South Florida. As one of the least intensive forms of commercial land use and one of the most beneficial to wildlife, maintaining ranching as a viable industry in Florida makes excellent conservation sense. I'm Dr. Marty Main. Thanks for joining me on the Florida Master Naturalist Program.